Good morning, Endicott students. I am here today with Professor Ashlie Perry, who is the chair of the Criminal Justice and Security Studies programs here at Endicott, and she will be teaching two classes for us this summer, POL 260 Identity Politics and SST 100 Intro to Contemporary U.S. Security Studies. She'll also be teaching on campus for us in the fall, Race and Justice, and that will be on Thursday nights starting in September. Professor Perry, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us first a little bit about your background and how you came to Endicott?
So my background is one of those complicated ones where I started off in undergrad as a psych major and I minored in African and African American studies, and then I got my master's in clinical and counseling psychology. So I continued on in psychology, and I was studying inmates. I was studying forensics and malingering in the legal system, which is a sophisticated way of saying lying. How do people lie to plead insanity or incompetent? And so after I finished my master's degree, I worked for the Department of Corrections as a psych specialist. So I did case management, I helped with diagnoses, and just worked with inmates, helping them adjust to life in prison. And while working with them, I noticed that the legal system was kind of putting a bandage on a wound, a giant wound. So many inmates were coming in who had mental health issues or lacked resources on the street that kind of led to this interesting path of them coming to prison. So I thought, I'm going to go back to grad school again, but this time I want to study the motivation for criminal behavior. And so I went to get my doctorate in global affairs. So I specialize in security studies and political psychology. So I got to marry my psychology with political science and criminal justice. And so I worked with some think tanks, and then I saw that Endicott had a security studies position open, and I have been teaching full-time in psychology. So I just transitioned into teaching sort of all of these things. So that's why I teach classes in criminal justice, political science, international studies, because that's basically what my doctorate was. I was in 4 different departments at one time.
Wow. A lot of cross disciplines there for you. That's awesome. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about how you are as a professor? What do you like about teaching? What do you think your strengths are as a teacher?
So the thing that I like about teaching, and also what I think is one of my strengths, is that I like to encourage students to be uncomfortable, just a little bit. I think being uncomfortable encourages you to do either one of two things. Either it's going to help you think more about your very salient views of the world, or it's going to challenge you to think, is this really my idea, or is this something that I learned from somewhere else and I need to really reevaluate it? A lot of times in the classes that I teach, I talk about very controversial things, whether it's talking about discrimination in the criminal justice system, talking about your identity as a woman or identity as an LGBTQ plus person. I talk about controversial things. So I really want students to feel uncomfortable so that they can embrace their real thoughts. And I also want them to think of a different perspective on that topic. Just the way that we view the world is not the way the world actually is. It's just our view of it. So I think that's one of my strengths. Students frequently say when they leave a class, like, I never thought of it from that perspective. And that's all I want. I don't want to change your view. I just want you to think of a different perspective.
Wow, I love that. I think it is a good time for all of us to be a little uncomfortable. Yeah. I think college is a time where you can explore, it's a time to change and have different perspectives. So I love that. All right, let's talk a little bit about these two classes. First, let's talk about identity politics. I think the title is a little ambiguous and students maybe don't understand what that means. So can you talk a little bit about that class specifically?
Sure. So in identity politics, it's one of those courses where it touches on both psychology and political science, and a little bit of sociology, actually. The idea is that politics is largely influenced by who we are as individuals. So for myself, I'm at the intersection of being a woman and a person of color. Both of those things impact how I view the political system and actually how I vote and how I interact with other people. So in the course, we look at things like gender and sexuality. We look at religion and how your beliefs can influence who you vote for or who you won't vote for. So all of these identities and the intersections that we live at, that's basically what the class is about. So we talk about whether or not our views in America on, age and not to get too much into the class topic, but there's so many things about our identity as Americans that influences the way that we vote. And also our religious beliefs influences our laws at its root, right? Like thou shalt not kill, we have laws against killing people, right? Like there's homicide and murder. So all of these things are intertwined in our politics. And I kind of just go in and say like, here's this identity and this is where it's influencing us. Here's this identity and here's where it's influencing us as well. And what makes this class is a little different is that I don't just focus on US politics. I also kind of look at how those identities are shown in other parts of the world as well.
So how many times have you taught this class?
I would say 5 or 6 times. It's one of those things where this class could be, you know, housed under gender studies. Like I said, it could be housed under sociology. It just touches on so many different aspects of who we are as humans and how we don't even know that the fact that I grew up in the South as a Georgian, I think of the world very differently from someone who's from New England. And I have these conversations with students offline about, you know, again, not to get too controversial, but about guns, right? Like where you live in the world, if you have very strict gun laws, you view the use of guns very differently than someone who comes from an open carry state and people take guns into church, right? So all of these identities really influence your view of the world.
Wow, that's so true. Thank you for that. I think that explains the course much better than the course description. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the other class you're teaching for us this summer, the Intro to Contemporary U.S. Security Studies.
So this is my favorite class. So it's one of my favorite classes because this is actually what my doctorate is in, is security studies. And so security studies, we tend to think of just terrorism, but security studies actually talks about global health, global diseases, which before COVID, the thing that we talked about the most in that class was Ebola and how it was a transnational disease. In that class, we talk about human trafficking, organ smuggling. There's so many threats to a nation state that goes beyond terrorism. Like the grid, the national energy grid is one of the biggest threats that a nation state can face. So when students come in, they think, oh, we're just gonna talk about terrorism for a semester. And I'm like, no, we actually have a class called Terrorism Studies. What we're going to talk about here is how a tornado or a flood can actually create like a whole pandemic in a country, because rising waters means that there are going to be mosquitoes, which means there are outbreaks of diseases, which means people are out on the street. So things like just something as simple as a flood can tear up an economy of a whole nation state. So that's kind of what that class is about, looking at everything but terrorism. I mean, we talk about it, it's a very small section, but it's so many other things that could go wrong in a nation.
And so who do you find usually takes that class? Is that usually just criminal justice students, or do you have kind of across the board?
It's across the board. So the title is usually intriguing to mostly CJ students, but I have a lot of students that come from education. I've had students from business. It just varies. Students are like, oh, that's an interesting title. I wonder what that's about. And then they come in and then I usually end up having them for another class, because I then teach something like terrorism studies and they're like, now I want to learn about just that. But yeah, so that's, it's a variety of students come.
Okay, that's good to know. All right, so let's now shift into the fall, where hopefully we will be back on campus. And you can be with Professor Perry right on campus on Thursday nights in CJ 355, Race and Justice. So what can you tell us about that class?
So it's very interesting right now that we're having all this social movement around inequalities in the system. This course has been around for a very long time. And one of the books that I use, The Color of Justice, highlights a lot of those inequalities, from sentencing to just interactions with police officers. So we actually look at, first off, what is ethnicity? So the first thing that we kind of break into is, what is race? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be Hispanic? And then we go into statistics about who commits what types of crimes. And so I try to just start with a blank slate, like what you thought about race, what you thought about who commits crimes. Let's actually look at facts. And then from there, we build on to If you're a juvenile, what's your likelihood of having an interaction with the police officer? We actually look at some videos of police encounters. And then we have group discussions about that. What does it mean? How can we change these things to make society more equitable? Some of the things that have been done have been things like changing the mandatory minimum sentencing for things like crack versus cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
But we also know from Central Park 5 that there's so many checks and balances that don't happen that allow people to end up incarcerated in the CJ system based on whether you're a woman, a man, a person of color, and also we touch on sexuality as well.
Can you tell me a little bit about how the course is structured as far as assignments? Is it mostly papers? Do they do some projects?
So there are projects. There's a overall in-term paper, but along the way, each person picks a topic and they usually are the discussion leader for that week. And that's usually I try to do that online so that there's a little less fear of being able to speak up about the topic.
Right.
But you do a discussion and then we have small assignments. So one of the things that I do in this class that I really like, and it's a little controversial, is I have them listen to song lyrics from various artists. So I had them look at We're Gonna Be All Right by Kendrick Lamar, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, and then compare songs from the 70s and 3 years ago and look at the message that's in there. And you'll see that it parallels very much so about speaking about police brutality in the African-American community. So something as small as that is also something that you can also see that this has been dialogue that's been happening for quite some time. So I think the spirit of Endicott, which I think people say a lot, which I actually really believe, is that it's kind of this really wonderful bubble that we're in. And it's a great, it's in college, this is your opportunity to challenge yourself, it's a safe space. It's a safe space to say, I don't know, or I don't understand, can you help me? And then faculty and staff are really willing to reach out and help you in whatever way that we can. If I understand that, a student needs help, they're not really understanding the assignment, or they want to know how they can study better, I have these open hours for students to reach out to me and say like, hey, this is what's going on with me. Can you help me? And I'm like, sure, of course, because I want them to succeed in the course. And I think that's what makes Endicott special. Also, I think that students really appreciate being a part of the nest, right? Like it is a tight knit community. If I see there's something that I can't help you with, but I know there's another member of the Endicott family that can, I'm able to point them in that direction because I know faculty and staff well enough that I can kind of direct them where they need to go. I think that's one of the things that make Endicott very special.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Perry. That's really great. We're going to put all those courses out, and I think this is really going to help the students understand exactly what they're getting into when they sign up for these classes.
Excellent.
Thank you.